Glad you're here. My name is Dr. Paul Sloan. I'm the chair of theology here in the School of Christian Thought. So welcome to our annual A.O. Collins lecture, where we're going to hear from Dr. Esau McCaulley, not a professional gong player. Before I introduce him, I'd like to say just a few words of thanks and an announcement. I want to thank Mark Burton, whose donation sponsors this lecture, enabling us to bring world-renowned scholars from all over to provide really interesting and engaging lectures. Most recently, we've had Drs. Catherine Sonderegger, Edith Humphrey, David Moffat, and a long list of others. But of course, this evening we'll hear from Dr. Esau McCaulley. So Mark, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Mark. By way of announcement, a few things. First, immediately following Dr. McCaulley's lecture, we'll have a Q&A in this room. So if a question occurs to you from his lecture, you may get an opportunity to ask it. There are a lot of you, so I don't know if we'll get to ask them all. But second, right after the Q&A, we'll have a reception in the hallway just outside these doors, generously provided by Heights Church. So Eddie Crowell, Shannon O'Hara, and Heights Church, thank you. So thanks for your sponsorship of that. Third, alongside these refreshments, we'll have Dr. Esau McCaulley's book, How Far to the Promised Land, for sale. So finally now to our speaker. I've known Dr. McCaulley, Esau, as he'll insist I call him for the intro, since 2013. We first met, actually don't know if he remembers this, my memory at least, is that we first met in the quad outside of St. Mary's in St. Andrews, is where we did our Ph.D. I didn't know at the time, but it turned out that we would be office mates for the next 3 years, so quite literally back to back. So I have to say, at least I don't think this is controversial, we weren't like instant best friends. That isn't to say that we weren't friendly or anything like that, it was just that our that would have been the time for the gong. It's more just that like it wasn't like an instant immediate friendship. Here's how I remember it happening. He may have a different story, but here's how I remember it. So for context, in our office, it was quite cramped. 5 or 6 of us in a given office. So again, like I said, Esau and I were literally back to back. And one day, it happened that we both happened to lean back at the same time, and we bumped into each other. And I turned around to look at him, and he turned around to look at me, and we were both watching ESPN highlights of the same NBA game from the night before with our headphones on. And we were like, oh, hey. So that's kind of when it started. I soon started that my appreciation for Curry's 2015, 2016 Warriors was outmatched by his appreciation of LeBron's Cavs. Don't applaud. Or only applaud for the right one. So that actually led through the years to some happy times bonding over the NBA and then, of course, over New Testament and then over our just Christian fellowship. And actually, that NBA stuff culminated in a friendly bet in 2016, where I, of course, bet on the Warriors over the Cavs. If anyone remembers that season, that was when the Warriors were a 73-win team and ended up being Cavs Warriors in the finals. Warriors were up 3-1 in the series. Just looked like an easy win. And they ended up losing several nail-biters, including the final Game 7. I walked in the office the next day, and a testimony to Esau's kindness, when I walked in the office, he just looked at me, kind of pressed his lips together, and looked down and nodded and didn't say anything about it. He knew the wound was too fresh. Granted, I did lose the bet, so I had to wear a LeBron jersey publicly, which I have since paid the debt. So I will say, though, actually, after that, none of the Warriors wins. They won a few championships, and I don't think you ever won a Warriors jersey. So anyway, whenever you feel like it. But since then, Esau has been a friend to me and to many, but you all, if you're here, you probably know him for his prolific work in New Testament and his other writings. So Dr. McCaulley is an author and the Jonathan Blanchard Associate Professor of New Testament and Public Theology at Wheaton College. His writing and speaking focus on New Testament exegesis, African American biblical interpretation, and public theology. He's authored lots of books, including Sharing in the Son's Inheritance and Reading While Black, African American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope, which won lots of awards, including Christianity Today's Book of the Year. Esau also served as editor of New Testament in Color, a multi-ethnic commentary on the New Testament, which is freshly out. And on the popular level, Esau's recent memoir, How Far to the Promised Land, what we have on sale outside, was named by Amazon as a top 5 nonfiction book of 2023. He's actually also written a children's book, Josie Johnson's Hair and the Holy Spirit, and Andy Johnson and the March for Justice. He's also a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and a senior editor for a newly released podcast, the Holy Post Media, as well as the host, of a new podcast with the Holy Post that just has come out this fall. So I encourage you to look into that if you're interested. His writings have appeared really all over the place: The Atlantic, Washington Post, Christianity Today, New York Times. So I'm really delighted that he's here tonight to speak on slavery, agency, and freedom, the curious case of Paul, Philemon, and Onesimus. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Esau McCaulley. Sorry, you were going to shake hands.
I don't know. So, if I remember correctly, I think you wore a T-shirt and not an actual jersey, which I feel like is not actually fulfilling the bet, but we'll let that slide for right now. Forgive me for hitting I just flew in from New York, and anytime I fly during the day that I speak, I get a little loopy and a little bit silly, so please forgive me if I'm a little bit incoherent. And I want to thank you all for inviting me to Houston. It is a great city. I have been here, I think this is my 3rd time, and maybe afterwards someone could tell me about a decent barbecue spot I need to hit before I leave, because they don't have real good barbecue in the suburbs of Chicago, nor can I easily access sweet tea. Isn't that sad? You should feel bad for me. One thing I should tell you, I've been seeing like the posters. I promise I'm going to say stuff about Paul in the Bible and Jesus in a second, I promise. I've been seeing those posters, and I want to give you all some advice. If someone ever takes a picture of you, don't let it be your favorite jacket, because then you can never wear it in public again, because it's like you only have one jacket. And so I've been a little bit sad about the fact that I can't wear that brown jacket that you've seen on the poster. But thank you all for coming nonetheless. Now, as a way of orienting you to Paul, Onesimus, and Philemon, and my wider hopes for this paper, I want to tell you about a story back when I was a Ph.D. student at the University of St. Andrews. It was my first year in the program, and I was like those students who were excited to learn about the Bible and figure out whether or not you had enough of the stuff to really survive. And so I went to this conference in Manchester a few hours down the road. And I don't remember many of the papers given at that conference. It was kind of a blur. But I do recall the cafeteria, where all the students and scholars gathered. Imprinted in my memory was how white that community was. I had assumed before that it was mostly St. Andrews that was unique, and there were very few African American or Latino scholars in biblical studies. But when I was in front of all of the biblical scholars in New Testament in England, actually more broadly Europe, it made it clear to me that I was an outlier, not just at the University of St. Andrews, but the Guild more broadly. So I reflected on this reality that I was one of the few black people there. I went into the cafeteria, and it was there that I found the black people. Most of the people serving the meals were black, and nearly all the scholars nibbling their food and discussing the latest Pauline theory were white. And no one saw this as odd or worthy of note. No one asked the question of how the world of academia that we have constructed influences the kinds of presentations we produce or the scholarly questions we consider. Then I reflected a little bit, because I had some time on myself, on church attendance. And I got home and I went to my trusted friend Google, and I found out that both in the United States, people of color far outstrip white churches in attendance on any given Sunday. And of course, biblical studies isn't just limited to Christians, but at least odd that African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos had such high rates of church attendance. They're in church most Sundays, but they were almost absent from the academy. A multitude of answers as to why that's the case could be posited, but I can only consider one angle that bears upon the subject of the curious case of Philemon, Onesimus, and Paul. I want to suggest that so few African Americans are involved in scholarship because of the scholarship we produce, its tenor, its content, its culture, and its tone was conceived and continues to be executed largely without Black interest in mind. That conference was one of 1,000 small hints that if I was going to be a biblical scholar, I was going to have to do the things that we do in the Guild a little bit differently. And that brings us to the curious case of Paul, Onesimus, and Philemon. Much controversy surrounds this letter, including the context and Paul's aim. Was Onesimus a runaway slave or merely a wandering slave? Did he seek Paul out, or was Onesimus sent by Philemon to Paul? Did Paul write with the goal of seeing Onesimus manumitted or not? But to be honest, I am not simply a scholar who happened to find this particular text interested. I am an American descendant of the enslaved. And a particular interpretation of Philemon was used to argue that escaped slaves should be dutifully returned to their masters. Stated differently, I'm interested in how this text is read and interpreted. And the first lesson I had to learn as a scholar is that it's okay to be interested. But I was taught somewhere along the way that such interests are a hindrance to be set aside, a bias we must let go of as a requirement to entering the Guild. We academics must only have eyes. Our job is to scour the history, learn the grammar, and in so doing, read the text clearly. But I came to realize that I didn't just have eyes, I had ears. And as I read the history of interpretation, I couldn't help but hear the echoes of slave master religion and the supposedly neutral scholarship that had been handed to me. And I'm not the first to notice this. Hear the words of Marcus Barth and Blank on Philemon scholarship. This is what they said. And they're Germans, so nobody gets mad at Germans. Okay. Ancient and later modern commentaries on Philemon, and also monographs on Pauline ethics, appear to have a tacit understanding. It is the slave who has been guilty, not the master. The common prejudice against the slave is not supported by solid evidence drawn from Philemon. Rather, it may be a result of the bias on the side of the interpreters. They go on to explain why there might be a bias in our supposedly neutral scholarship. They continue. Philemon was almost exclusively expounded by men who were scholarly monks, priests, and pastors, established church leaders, or academic lights, living in relatively stable positions with better or worse domestics at hand. These words were penned nearly a quarter century ago, and since then this criticism has been made often. The idea that social location of scholars influences, in some sense, distorts the interpretation of the New Testament in a way that thwarts the hopes of the disinherited has also become a commonplace. We understand this. This frequent criticism that biblical studies is biased has become a part of the liturgy of the academy. We become kind of immune to its repeated protest. As a point of fact, such extended observational social location are one of the two types of papers that Black biblical scholars are allowed to give. Within the ecosystem of the academy, a Black biblical scholar standing before a largely white crowd has usually one of two options. First, he can rage against the biases of the academy. We can complain about the lack of diversity and call for change, option one. Option 2, we can display the mastery of the standard tools of the guild. In the latter path, we show that we are just as good as scholars as the majority culture. We can do technical work too, and not all of that race stuff. But the cost of doing option 2 is cutting us off from the communities and the passions that shape us. We must give up our interest or not be taken seriously as scholars. I would like to chart a third path. I think that we do need our eyes. My professors were not wrong to teach me to see the text and the world of the text as placing limits on our interpretations. We cannot make the text say what we wish it says. But nonetheless, I think the Academy also needs the ears of black and brown scholars that can point out the discordant notes, the odd tunes that we hear in the Academy. But much more fundamentally, our imaginations are needed, our minds. All biblical interpretation is a weighing of competing probabilities, right? Maybe this or maybe that. If the perhaps or the maybes in the majority culture has ruled today for too long, maybe it's past time for the black and brown scholars to have an imaginative moment. So in the time that remains, I want to do two things. I want to examine briefly the scholarly proposals, the perhaps, on offer for interpreting the curious case of Paul, Philemon, and Onesimus. And then secondly, I'm going to offer a fresh, historically plausible interpretation. Now, my interpretation is undoubtedly informed by my sensitivity to the issues of slavery and manumission. I do not doubt that. I cannot help but be influenced by the complicated legacy of slavery and Christianity in the antebellum South in the United States and its ongoing impact on the life of African peoples. But if that is my bias, I want to say that the ignoring of these realities have hindered other scholars in the past. So here we go. Part 1, discordant notes. Sounds odd. All discussion of Paul, Philemon, and Onesimus must begin with the first interpretation that kind of sets the tone for the standard hypothesis, the runaway slave hypothesis. And it's written by a guy named Chrysostom in the 4th century. In his homily on Philemon, he says the following. This excellent man, Philemon, then had a certain slave named Onesimus. This Onesimus had been stolen something from his master, had run away. For that he had stolen, hear what it says. If he has wronged you or owes you anything, I will repay you. Coming therefore to Paul at Rome, and having found him in prison, and having enjoyed the benefits of his teaching, he also there received baptism. Paul therefore writes, recommending him to his master, that on every count he should forgive him and receive him as one now regenerate. Chrysostom goes on to state that Onesimus was a runaway, a thief, and a robber. Thomas Aquinas refers to his act of theft as a sin of which he repented. Sounds odd, doesn't it? John Calvin, any Calvinist here, here's his moment. He calls him a contemptible slave, a thief, and a runaway. Sorry, Church of England, here's J.B. Lightfoot, the Anglicans. He says the following about him. He was a thief and a runaway. His offense did not differ in any way insofar as we know from the vulgar type of slavish offenses. He seems to have done just what the representative slave in the Roman comedy threatens to do when he gets into trouble. He had packed up his goods and taken to his heels. Rome was the natural cesspool for these offscourings of humanity. More recent scholars have been more reluctant to opine on Onesimus' character in such stark terms, but it still sounds a little bit off. James Dunn. It is also clear, it's clear, that Onesimus had wronged his master in some way. G.K. Bill. Paul writes this letter to Philemon because Philemon's slave has wrongly left the service of his master. Wintle and Nichols, writing in the Asian Bible commentary, said that Onesimus repented for wrongdoing. This suggests not only that Onesimus was wrong, but that he recognized it as such. Another scholar suggests, and I didn't put him on here because it takes too long to quote, but he says that Paul did not want to argue for Onesimus' freedom because Paul was afraid that if Onesimus was freed, he wouldn't return to Paul in service, but he might go and start his own life. So because Paul was afraid that he would use his freedom poorly, Paul doesn't argue for his freedom. All this, I want to say, tickles the ears of the descendants of the enslaved. A question left unanswered or even underanalyzed is, can an enslaved person who is being held against their will steal? Is it stealing if they spent the large portions of their lives doing unpaid or underpaid labor? Is theft the proper description of that act? Interestingly enough, in another part of the canon, this question was actually raised. Theologians often struggle with the fact that God tells the Jewish people, the Israelites, to plunder the Egyptians on their way out of slavery. And so the theologians began to ask the question, did God command his people to steal, therefore breaking the commandment, thou shalt not steal? Thomas Aquinas, who we just saw a minute ago, remember him? He actually weighs in on this topic, and he says the following: God ordered this to be done, the plundering of the Egyptians, on account of the ill treatment accorded to the Israelites by the Egyptians. In other words, Thomas Aquinas, who's speaking about Israel, said the plundering of Egyptians was a form of reparations. Matthew Shee, commenting on Aquinas' interpretation of this event, says this: God intends the Egyptians' possessions to serve as compensation for the injustices against the Israelites, which is due to the Israelites for their wrong suffering owed by the Egyptians for their wrongdoing. Further, do we have evidence that the Greco-Roman enslaved people saw themselves as thieves if they did take some money? Now, we have no record of this question, but interestingly enough, we do have this question in pre-Civil War America, and the Southern slaves certainly did not. Harriet Jacobs, in her book, or her memoir, Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl, reflects on the actions of a certain slave named Luke, who's taken something. He says, Luke is talking to her about what happened. He says this: when a man has his wages stolen from him, and the laws sanction and enforce the theft, how can he be expected to have more regard to honesty than the man who robs him? I confess, she says this, I confess that I agree with the thinking that he had the right to that money as a portion of his wages. Interesting theological reflection by the enslaved. I want to suggest that the scholarly distance, this idea that we can sit back and just describe reality, and the lack of expressed empathy for the experiences of the enslaved informs our descriptions of texts and realities. There is nothing inherently scholarly about adopting the disposition of the empire when describing the world in which characters lived, moved, and breathed in the New Testament. There's nothing scholarly about saying it is theft if the master saw it as theft. That's adopting imperial logic in the interpretation of text. Yes, the view held by moneyed Roman citizens would be that an enslaved person taking his enslaver's goods, or even taking himself from his enslavers, was indeed wrong. According to the empire, that renders one a thief and a runaway. But that is not a neutral observation. To depict it as neutral is a latent advocacy for the slave master view of things, not an articulation of things as they actually were. This tendency of sympathy with the existing structure of the empire comes most clearly in the last one I'm going to cite for you all today. I want to say scholarly distance did not produce better scholarship. That's my basic claim. This is written in 2005. I won't cite the person. It doesn't help. But he gets to the end of his introduction of the story of Philemon, and he's pondering why there was not a stronger call for manumission in this letter, which we'll talk about later. And he explains why in this following paragraph. Forgive me for recording it at length. And he's explaining why slavery was not criticized by Paul in the New Testament. He says slavery was, in fact, an integral part of the social structure of the Roman world. And without it, the Roman Empire would have been reduced to chaos. It was the slaves who carried out most of the menial tasks, the tilling of land, domestic service, secretarial, and other duties. To replace them by paid labor would have had far-reaching economic effects. Moreover, the life of the slave was not necessarily one of hardship. Sorry, I can't believe I put this in there. Admittedly, he was deprived of freedom, had no rights to citizenship, no part in his control of affairs of state or city. But he could earn in his savings towards the eventual purchase of his freedom, and he had some food and drink and shelter. In some respect, indeed, he may be better off than the poorer classes in the free population. That statement, admittedly, he was deprived of freedom and had no rights, followed by a nonetheless, is startling. Further, to hear a stability argument for the maintenance of slavery in the Greco-Roman world is, to say the least, unsettling. It's the same argument for slavery used in the Confederacy. And that has nothing to do with the interpretation of Philemon. I contend that such readings trouble and disturb and contribute to the lack of African American presence in biblical studies. Now, aside from what I think I've shown is an ongoing, centuries-long cultural bias against Philemon that was running into text up to 2005, there are actually exegetical reasons to question the runaway slave scenario. First, these can be stated pretty quickly. Paul never says in Philemon the Onesimus stole. The if-then statement that functions as the basis of the argument on verse 18, if he owes you anything, I will repay it, is what is known in Greek as the first-class conditional statement. That indicates the assumption of truth for the sake of the argument. It's saying, if this were true, this would follow. It doesn't mean this is true, therefore this follows. So even if he was doing this, then that's what's going on. Third, Onesimus never expresses remorse. The entire language of repentance that fills all of the scholarship is never actually articulated by Paul or the person on behalf he's speaking. Fourth, it is unlikely, to me almost improbable, that an escaped slave happens upon Paul in prison. There's a guy there. Who are you? I'm Paul. You want to be a Christian? Sure, there we go. So for a variety of reasons, this idea that he was merely a runaway slave who happened to run into Paul in Rome has fallen upon hard times. And that's led to a bunch of hypotheses. There are like 20 of these. Only got time for 4 because you got other stuff to do on a Thursday. It's Thursday? This Friday? It's Thursday. It's Thursday night. Okay, then, like buy one, get one free. Anyways, never mind. What y'all doing Thursdays here? The first theory I want to talk about that has been proposed as an alternative to the runaway slave theory is what I want to call the advocate theory. See, the unlikelihood, then, of an escaped slave running into the person, Paul, who had happened to convert his master, has led people to search for alternative readings. A popular thesis is that Onesimus was not, in fact, an escaped slave. He was either an errant slave or a wandering slave or a slave who needed some kind of advocacy. In the Greco-Roman world, a slave who got in trouble with his master often sought the aid of those who could advocate for them to their masters. This would involve if a slave did something with a business deal or some other disagreement. And according to this view, Onesimus seeks out Paul to intervene on his behalf. This reconstruction solves the problem of Paul sending Onesimus back into slavery, because Onesimus never wanted to be free. Onesimus' goal was reconciliation. It also explains why Onesimus sought out Paul, because he needed someone to help him. A central piece of evidence is a supposed parallel, namely a letter from Pliny to Sabinius, and Sabinius is a freedman, a freed slave who had gotten in trouble with his master. Pliny writes the letter to Sabinius, his former owner, and Pliny says he is sorry, he's going to change, he came to me weeping, please forgive him and take him back. Now, there are three problems, at least that I see with this theory. First, in most cases of the advocate thesis, the assumption is still that Onesimus did something wrong. He may not be a thief, but he's horrible at business. And this enslaver in most reconstructions is rightly displeased with him. So again, there's a bias against the enslaved. Second, the supposed parallel, the letter to Sabinius, is filled with statements of regret and repentance, something noticeably absent in Paul. The parallel says we're sorry, Paul never apologizes at all. Third, although it is true that freedmen had ongoing connections to their former masters that was analogous to slavery, slaves and freedmen are actually not the same. And there are no extant letters of advocacy on behalf of the people who were enslaved. A second theory that people often cite is called the sent slave theory. Namely, the idea that Onesimus was sent to serve Paul, and while serving Paul, he was converted. So Philemon sends Onesimus, or the church there sends Onesimus to Paul, and while he's there, he becomes a Christian. Now, Paul is sending him back with a letter requesting his manumission so that he can engage in ministry with Paul. This interpretation has been long played by an original reconstruction by a guy named Knox. We don't need to go to it, but the idea is that a lot of the historical background behind this theory has now been called into question. The other issue that I think is probably more fundamental for this audience is if Onesimus was as troubled a slave as he appears to be, Paul calls him formerly useless. Why would you send someone who is such a troubled slave to serve Paul? You'd probably send someone who you trusted more. So I just don't think that the sent slave hypothesis is really going to get you where you want to go. More recently, had a black guy. What's called the broken fellowship theory. And instead of laying the blame at Onesimus for fleeing, Lewis Brogden suggests that Philemon was leading a hypocritical church. While Philemon displayed great respect and care towards the free members of his congregation, according to Brogden, he excluded slaves, much like Paul does in Corinth. In Corinth, there's this issue of one group eating here, the other group eating there, and he's saying the same thing is happening here in Philemon's church. As evidence of this view, Brogden points out the much neglected fact that Onesimus was exposed to the gospel in Philemon's house, but he did not become a Christian there. He became a Christian apart from Philemon because of Philemon's exclusionary practices. Now, I do believe that Onesimus' conversion away from Philemon is exegetically significant. I think that's actually important. But I think that when Paul says that Philemon was a good dude, he actually was, for Paul, a person of character. And if there was a problem with Philemon's character, I think Paul would have said it. Another African-American author has a different take on Philemon. Callahan revives the idea from the abolitionist argument that Philemon and Onesimus were not a master-slave relationship, but it was a dispute between two brothers. He bases this in part on the extensive use of brotherly love as a key part of the epistle. Now, people haven't followed him because all of the language of slavery in this text cannot be metaphorical. And his elimination of saying slavery wasn't involved has influences our interpretation of his discussion of verse 16. In verse 16 of Philemon, Paul says that they were brothers in the flesh and in the Lord. And Callahan, picking up on the abolitionist argument, says that refers to actually a familial relationship. And because they were family members, they cannot have a master-slave relationship. And we're going to come back to that later. But I do want to say this. There is one person who agrees with him. We'll come to him back in a minute. Bruce Longenecker, who says that Philemon and Onesimus may have in fact been biologically brothers. So, if I don't take this broken fellowship or advocate or sent slave or wandering slave, what might I have to say about Onesimus? All biblical scholarship, I want to suggest, involves a bit of the imagination. Well-reasoned and informed guessing. Yeah, we guess a lot. The filling in of gaps where the answers that we want to exist are on fragments of data that can be arranged this way and that. I want to suggest that some of the failure of the imagination and the backing away from the imaginative reconstructions in the case of Philemon is quite odd. What I mean by that is scholars get really conservative sometimes when it comes to hypothesis about this particular text. Quite often when you see in these texts, you'll see a long list of options and then concluding, we cannot say, and then they opt back for the runaway slave hypothesis. But creating a viable backstory that I in part made up is not in principle different from reconstruction warring gospel communities, informing the writings of the gospels, or the divergent reconstructions of the situation in Galatia or Rome. Need I mention Q, or the various theories about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the community of righteousness and the teacher of righteousness? I don't even need to add the endless hypotheses based upon limited data about the philosophies that Paul believed are confronted in Colossae. Why are we so afraid when it comes to Onesimus? I think we must either play the game in this text like we do with the other ones, or step aside. And try as we might, it is always us, the scholar, doing the imagination. It is not some unmoved mover, but us with our experiences and biases. Yes, we go to the past, but we carry the present with us. So how do I put together this puzzle? A question that has been plaguing me since I started studying this text, that have dominated my reflections over the last 2 to 3 years. What if the central issue that has plagued the last 2 centuries of scholarship on this epistle, namely the relationship between Christianity and slavery, is itself the driving issue motivating the actions of Onesimus? Lost in the competing theories about Paul and his aims or the Greco-Roman world are the actions of the person who set the events in motion. If we take Paul's description of Philemon seriously, then he was a good person and a faithful Christian. We have no evidence that he treated his slaves poorly. We also know that it is likely that Onesimus heard the gospel while in the home of his master consistently. And we also know that it was common for slaves to adopt the religions of their masters. But despite the fact that Philemon was kind, Onesimus did not become a Christian through the ministry of the church that met in Philemon's house. Despite his kind treatment, it seems that Onesimus fled from the home of Philemon simply because he no longer wanted to be a slave. I think we have one shining fact that reveals something about the character of the man who's at the center of this story. He ran. Why flee to Paul? It seems improbable that he happened upon Paul while Paul was under some form of arrest without seeking Paul out. And so those who advocate for some form of the sent slave theory are strong, with the intercession theory, they are strong here because there's no other reason for him to encounter Paul. But what if instead of an economic issue that drove him to Paul, what if it was a theological issue that drove him to Paul? After all, Paul is a pastor and a theologian. If Onesimus heard about Paul through the Christian community that met in Philemon's house, then Paul would be the perfect person to help him wrestle with his theological dilemma. So it is possible that he seeks Paul out to receive the answer to the very question we've been struggling to answer. Can one be free and a Christian? There's a great deal of scholarship, mountains of it, some of it I referred to earlier, that because slaves still had ongoing ties to their masters, or because of the economic trials that might follow upon manumission, it's hard to be a freed slave, that our modern focus on freedom is overstated. Therefore, manumission is not what a slave might want. To this, I only have one retort. Why did slaves keep escaping? Why were there extensive laws forbidding their departure and tremendous expense put towards their return? Have we become so comfortable with the idea of freedom that we can't imagine the thing itself as having value? Slaves in the antebellum South, and presumably Rome, ran from kind masters and cruel masters, young masters and old masters, men and women. They ran and they ran and they ran in every culture known to humanity. We have little written material from Greco-Roman slaves themselves, but I want to suggest that they voted with their feet when they were seeking the warmth of other suns. Onesimus' departure, then, was a vote for freedom. And as a free person, the best reason to explain why he went to seek out a religious leader is because he had a religious question. Maybe he wanted to hear the claims of Christianity unhindered by the burdens due to his master. Contrary to what we've heard repeatedly, he does not hear the gospel from Paul. He wrestles with the gospel with Paul and is converted. But Paul, interestingly enough, does not attribute his return to his conversion. No, he does not say, Onesimus became a Christian and he knows that he should return. No, the plot twist is not his conversion. Let me say this again. Paul doesn't say he came back because he's a Christian. And I want to suggest that if all that happened between this meeting was their conversion, his conversion, we probably never hear from Onesimus again, and maybe this letter doesn't exist. The plot twist is in how vital Onesimus becomes to Paul in his ministry. That is the issue. If he's going to continue to minister alongside Paul, given Paul's frequent arrest and rabble-rousing, it will be impossible to do so as a wanted man. The possibility of capture is simply too high. The issue then I want to suggest isn't, can an escaped slave be a Christian? The answer to that appears to be yes. The question, can an escaped slave serve alongside Paul while a fugitive? The answer to that seems to be no. Philemon bears all the marks of being the work of Paul with the strong input of Onesimus. The reason I want to suggest there is no admission of wrongdoing or repentance anywhere in the epistle is quite simply because Onesimus did not believe he had done anything wrong. There is something of a psychological profile available with this limited data. This slave ran. There's a letter written on behalf of this slave that doesn't mention repentance. There's something, I think, there. Why doesn't Paul simply tell Philemon to manumit Onesimus? Because I think that he actually does want the action to be one done in love, not coercion. Paul is, I think, a pastoral theologian in the end. And the gospel does influence how Paul reasons. Most of the rhetorical analysis of the letter highlights Paul's self-description as a lowly prisoner to influence Philemon are correct. Paul places himself in Onesimus' position so that Philemon can finally see that rights and social standing have no place in Christianity. When Paul says, I pray that the sharing of our faith may become effective when you perceive all the good that we may do for Christ, he means it. But what is the good that Paul wants him to do? Here's where I want to press home one particular point about conjecture. Paul says the following, already in the letter. I want you to receive him as you will receive me. 2, he says, if there's any debt or issue arising from his absence, charge it to my account. Then he says, confident of your obedience, I'm writing you, knowing that you will do even more than I say. What is this more apart from manumission? Treat him as a brother, he's already said it. Welcome him, he's already said it. He's already explicitly asking for the forgiveness of all debt. It boggles the mind to me to think that an enslaved person, hearing the word more, would think in terms other than the possibility of manumission, especially one that has escaped in the past. And this is not simply a letter written to Philemon, it's the letter written to the entire community. Was there no one in that room who had the idea that maybe he should be free? We often contend that arguing on the basis of love is some kind of weakened form. But love stands at the center of Christian theology. And if love is sufficient to compel change, then Christians have no other part to play. So when Paul plays upon love and mutual sacrifice for one another, he's talking about what the gospel is and does. Now, these kinds of statements stand. I could stop the lecture here, but I'm going to do a little bit more. The preceding comments are valuable. I think that Paul wanted him to be freed on the basis of love. I think they're valuable regardless of how we understand the relationship between Paul and Philemon and Onesimus. But I think a further light can be shed if we take seriously the fact that maybe these were indeed brothers. But you don't know Greek, he says, no longer is a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, how much more to me, also more to you, a brother both in sarke and curio. That's the part that's in bold there. As we stated earlier, Callahan argued that this language here meant that they were fellow brothers and not therefore master and slave. But this has been not taken seriously because he ignored the slavery. But as you can see, these translations have kind of struggled to make sense of what's going on here. He is very dear to me and even dear to you, both as a fellow man, that's what they're interpreting in the flesh, both as a fellow man and as a brother. The New American Bible does the same thing. He is dear to me as a man and also in the Lord. The NRSV, right, is the only one that kind of keeps in the flesh language. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave. A beloved brother, especially to me, but how so much more to you, a brother, both in the flesh and in the Lord. Now, what might it mean there to refer to their brotherhood in the flesh? The most common reading of verse 16 is that Paul is speaking of their common humanity. On one hand, they're both human beings, and they're brothers in the Lord. And this interpretation is implied by the NIV translation of in the flesh as fellow man. Now, the problem is that this interpretation actually struggles to find much exegetical support. When Paul uses the word flesh or sarx, this will be intuitive to you, he usually means rejecting, he usually condemns confidence in the flesh, usually rejecting the belief that circumcision and other activities like fasting gave some special access to God. He also uses it to talk about human sinfulness, and he also refers to it sometimes as human standards. We once reviewed Jesus according to human standards, but we do so no longer. So the scholarly options that Paul is referring to this thing, this idea of the flesh, as this common bond, this earthly relationship that they continue to share, is something alien to Paul's own use of sarx. Paul does not use sarx to talk about a positive bond that functions as an argument for continued fellowship. Now, interestingly enough, when Paul isn't talking about sarx for sinfulness, he does actually use sarx quite often as a biological claim. In Romans 1:3, 4:1, 9:3, 9:5, 11:14, and 10:18. So for the people who are going to say I'm making stuff up, I'm going to say really quickly, I have 5 examples of sarx being used as a brother relationship, and I want to contend there are no parallels to what Paul does, is often seen to do in this part of Philemon. Here's our buddy Longenecker returning to help me out. He says, Philemon and Onesimus were, in fact, biologically related as offspring of a single father, with Onesimus being a slave within that household who was inherited by Philemon from that now deceased father. I think Longenecker is indeed correct. Interestingly enough, during Roman law at the time, they started changing the laws to make manumission more difficult, with certain exceptions. So they were saying too many slaves are being freed, we need to slow this down, but there was one exception. Slaves who were nursing or educating children, athletes, slaves who married their owners, and there was also manumission granted for paternal feelings for children whom the master had sired by a slave. In other words, even though we're making manumission more difficult, they had a provision here for freeing their master's children by a slave woman. And if Onesimus had been promised freedom by his father, who dies and passes him on to Philemon, you have some explanation of what the problem might have been. So this is what I want to contend. That we know that Onesimus ran. We know that he did not convert in the home of Philemon. We know that he ends up finding Paul. And that when he finds Paul, he doesn't express any remorse. And Paul makes this statement about wanting to keep him for gospel labor. And that Paul's normal use of sarx and the relevant Roman law suggest that what he actually has in mind is indeed brotherhood. So I want to contend that 2 brothers fighting about the issue of manumission that remained unresolved led to Onesimus' flight. On his decision to depart, he decides he wants to stop by Paul and hear a little bit about Christianity. The plot twist comes when Onesimus is converted. And that conversion and his desire to do ministry alongside Paul means that he must go back to his brother and be reconciled with the hopes of manumission so that he might continue in ministry alongside the apostle. And if I'm correct, then maybe we've been looking in the wrong place for early opposition to slavery. Maybe we shouldn't look to Paul or Philemon. Maybe we should turn to the escaped slave, Onesimus. Thank you.